The courthouse hallway smelled like old wood polish and broken dreams. Emma pressed herself against her mother's side as they walked toward the courtroom, Buddy's leash held firmly in her small hand. The golden retriever walked with practiced grace, his cream-colored fur freshly groomed, his demeanor calm and purposeful. He knew something important was happening today. Dogs always sense these things. Emma knew it too, though she wished desperately that she didn't. It had been exactly 3 years, 2 months, and 14 days since Buddy came into her life. She knew the precise count because she marked each anniversary in her diary with little paw print stickers. Before Buddy, Emma's world had been a terrifying place. Before Buddy, she couldn't go to school without her mother having to pick her up by noon. Before Buddy, she couldn't sleep without the lights on and her parents checking on her every 30 minutes. Before Buddy, she didn't know what it felt like to breathe normally. The anxiety had started when she was 9 years old, though nobody could pinpoint exactly why. Her therapist, doctor, had explained it as a combination of factors, possibly genetic predisposition, a stressful school environment, the general weight of growing up in a world that felt increasingly scary. But the why didn't matter much when Emma was lying on her bedroom floor at 2 a.m., convinced her heart was going to explode, convinced she was dying, convinced that no amount of reassurance from her parents would change the fact that something was terribly, irreversibly wrong with her. Then came Buddy. The Service Dog Training Center had put her through an extensive evaluation. They tested her compatibility with different dogs, assessed her needs, and ultimately decided that a 3-year-old golden retriever named Buddy was the perfect match. When they'd first met, Emma remembered being confused. Buddy was just a dog. How could a dog fix what was broken inside her? But within the first week, everything changed. Buddy learned to recognize the physical signs of Emma's anxiety before she even consciously felt them rising. A slight tension in her shoulders, a quickening of her breathing, the way her fingers would fidget with whatever was in her hands. When he sensed these changes, Buddy would press his warm body against her leg, grounding her. He'd rest his head on her lap. He'd make eye contact with her until her breathing slowed and her racing thoughts began to settle. At night, he slept at the foot of her bed, and Emma slept through the night for the first time in months. It was like someone had suddenly turned down the volume on the screaming in her head. Her parents had been thrilled. For the first time in years, they saw their daughter smile. Really smile, not the forced, tired smile of a child who'd learned to pretend for her parents' sake. Emma started going to school full days. She joined the school choir. She began spending weekends with friends instead of locked in her bedroom. Her mother cried happy tears. Her father hugged her and said he felt like he'd gotten his daughter back. That was the best year of Emma's life. But then everything fell apart, the way families sometimes do. It started with small arguments, about work, about money, about how to raise Emma, about whether her father was being supportive enough or whether her mother was being overprotective. Emma, with her heightened anxiety sensitivity, felt every tension in the air like electrical shocks. The arguments grew louder. The words grew sharper. Within 6 months, her parents had separated. Within a year, they were in divorce proceedings. And now, at 12 years old, Emma found herself standing in a courthouse, about to be dissected by lawyers and judges who would decide who got to keep her. The courtroom itself felt impossibly formal and hostile. High ceilings, thick wooden panels. The judge's bench loomed like a throne at the front of the room. Rows of hard wooden benches faced toward the center where testimonies would be given. The lighting was harsh and fluorescent, casting everything in a cold, clinical glow. There were lawyers in expensive suits, court reporters with their stenotype machines, bailiffs in uniform. Everything about this place screamed authority and judgment. Emma's mother squeezed her hand gently. "It's going to be okay, sweetheart," she whispered, though Emma could hear the anxiety in her voice too, had been terrified about this hearing for weeks. She'd consulted with her lawyer, David Martinez, at least a dozen times. They'd gone through practice sessions where Emma had been asked difficult questions, had explained carefully and age-appropriately what would happen today. but nothing really prepared you for the reality. Emma's father, Michael, sat on the opposite side of the courtroom with his lawyer, Mr. Richardson. Mr. Richardson was a tall, sharp-featured man with ice-blue eyes and a reputation for being aggressive in custody cases. He'd made a name for himself by winning cases, sometimes through questionable tactics. Emma's father had hired him specifically because of that reputation. Michael had shifted away from over the past year, influenced by Mr. Richardson's suggestions and the arguments of his new girlfriend, who thought Emma was being coddled by all this service dog business. "She's 12 years old," his girlfriend had said, loud enough for Emma to hear. "She doesn't need a dog to function. She's using it as a crutch. She'll never develop independence." Emma's father had started to believe it, or maybe he'd always believed it, and the girlfriend had just given him permission to say it out loud. Either way, he'd filed a motion requesting more custody, with the argument that Emma's reliance on Buddy was preventing her from developing resilience and independence. Now, as the judge entered and everyone stood, Emma felt Buddy's reassuring presence beside her. The dog didn't show any signs of anxiety. He sat perfectly still, his brown eyes alert but calm. She wondered if Buddy could sense that today was going to change everything. She wondered if he knew that his future with her was being decided in this room full of strangers. Judge, a woman in her late 60s with steel-gray hair and sharp, intelligent eyes, settled into her seat and opened the case file. She looked up at both parties, her expression neutral but authoritative. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the weight of 30 years of judicial experience. "We're here today regarding custody of Emma. This is a contentious case, and I expect both parties to present their arguments clearly and professionally. We will hear testimony, examine evidence, and ultimately determine what is in the best interest of the child. Let the record show that this hearing is now in session." Emma's stomach twisted into knots. Her palms began to sweat. She could feel the anxiety starting to crawl up her spine, that familiar sensation of dread and helplessness. She looked down at Buddy, and the dog looked back at her with complete, unwavering trust. Whatever happened today, she thought, at least she had him. Or did she? Emma's right hand trembled as she placed it on the Bible. The leather was worn smooth from thousands of hands before hers, and she wondered fleetingly how many other nervous people had touched this same book, sworn the same oath, felt the same crushing weight of truth-telling in a room full of strangers. "Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" the bailiff asked in a monotone voice that suggested he'd recited this phrase approximately 7,000 times. "I do," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible over the slight hum of the air conditioning system. She climbed into the witness stand, which seemed impossibly tall. Her feet didn't quite touch the footrest, leaving her legs dangling slightly, making her feel even smaller and more vulnerable than she already was. Buddy remained in the gallery with Emma's mother, but she could feel his presence like an invisible thread connecting her to safety. She kept her eyes on him for as long as possible as she was sworn in. The first questions came from her mother's lawyer, David Martinez. He was kind and gentle, asking her basic biographical information. "How old are you? Where do you go to school? Do you like your school? What are your favorite subjects? What activities do you enjoy?" These questions felt safe. They had correct answers. Emma felt herself relaxing slightly, her heart rate dropping from its panicked state to something more manageable. David asked her about Buddy, when she got him, what he meant to her, how he helped her. Emma found herself talking more freely, her natural enthusiasm for the subject overriding her fear. She described how Buddy had changed her life, how she'd gone from being unable to attend school to being able to participate in class and extracurricular activities. She talked about how Buddy could sense when she was getting anxious before she even realized it herself. She explained, in the careful language her therapist had taught her, how the dog's presence helped regulate her nervous system. David nodded encouragingly and concluded his questioning. "Thank you, Emma. I have no further questions." Then it was Mr. Richardson's turn. He stood slowly, deliberately. Emma watched him rise from his chair like a predator unfurling itself. He was tall, well over 6 feet, and he moved with the confident swagger of someone who'd won many battles in this exact arena. His suit was perfectly tailored, his tie an expensive silk that probably cost more than Emma's entire wardrobe. His shoes were polished to such a shine that Emma could see the reflection of the courtroom lights in them. "Hello, Emma," he said, his voice smooth and friendly. "May I call you Emma?" "Yes," she replied, unsure if this was a trick question. "Emma, I'm Mr. Richardson. I represent your father. Now, I want you to know that I'm not here to trick you or hurt you. I just want to understand your situation better. Okay?" Emma nodded, not trusting her voice. "You said that Buddy helps you with your anxiety, correct?" "Yes." "And before you had Buddy, you had anxiety. You were anxious quite a bit." "Yes, but—" "Just yes or no answers is fine, Emma. Before Buddy, you had anxiety that prevented you from going to school." "Sometimes, but—" "Yes or no, Emma?" Emma's stomach clenched. "Yes." "And now that you have Buddy, you go to school every day." "Yes." "So the anxiety is gone." Emma hesitated. This was a trick. She could feel it. The anxiety wasn't gone. She still got anxious sometimes. Buddy just helped her manage it. But the way Mr. Richardson was asking the question, with his eyebrows slightly raised and his head tilted at an angle that suggested he already knew the answer he wanted, made her feel like anything she said would be used against her. "Not completely gone," she said carefully, "but better. Buddy helps me manage it." Mr. Richardson smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. "So you still have anxiety, you're still anxious. It's just that the dog helps you hide it better. Is that fair to say?" "No, that's not," Emma started. "Emma, I asked you a question. Is that a fair characterization?" Emma's mother's lawyer stood. "Objection. The witness is not being allowed to fully answer the question." The judge looked at Mr. Richardson. "Allow the witness to complete her answers, counselor." Mr. Richardson nodded smoothly. "Of course, Your Honor. Emma, would you like to try that answer again?" Emma took a breath. Her hands were starting to shake. "It's not about hiding it. Buddy helps my body calm down when it gets anxious. It's not about hiding. It's about my nervous system. Doctor explained that my nervous system gets triggered and Buddy helps it reset." "I see," Mr. Richardson said, walking slowly around the courtroom, his hands clasped behind his back. "So you're dependent on the dog to regulate your nervous system." "I wouldn't call it dependent. He helps me when I need help." "But you need him with you at school, correct? You need him with you at home. You need him with you when you go out in public. In fact, you need him with you all the time, don't you?" Each question landed like a small hammer blow. Emma could feel her anxiety climbing. Her fingers began to fidget with the edge of the witness stand. Her breathing had become shallower without her even noticing it happening. "He's my service dog," Emma said, trying to keep her voice steady. "That's what service dogs do. They provide a service." "And without this service dog, what happens? Do you have panic attacks?" "Sometimes." "Do you have difficulty breathing?" "Yes, but—" "Do you have trouble functioning?" "In some situations, yes, but that doesn't mean—" "It's true though, isn't it? Without the dog, you struggle. With the dog, you function. You're dependent on that dog for your ability to function normally. Isn't that fair to say?" The words hit Emma like physical blows. Dependent. The way he said it made it sound like weakness, like something shameful, like she was broken and clinging to a crutch instead of learning to walk on her own. She could feel her chest tightening. Her heart began to race again. The fluorescent lights suddenly seemed too bright, creating a harsh glare that made her eyes water. "My mother says I'm not dependent," Emma said quietly. "She says Buddy is a tool, like glasses are a tool for someone who can't see." "Your mother," Mr. Richardson repeated thoughtfully. And is your mother encouraging you to rely on the dog? Is she perhaps using the dog as a way to keep you close to her rather than spending time with your father? No, she. Your Honor, I'm concerned about the influence being exerted on this child, Mr. Richardson continued, directing his words to the judge now, though he kept his eyes on Emma. It seems clear that this child has been conditioned to believe she cannot function without this animal. She's become emotionally dependent on both the dog and her mother. This level of dependency is not healthy for a 12-year-old child. Emma's vision was definitely tunneling now. The sides of the room were becoming blurry. She could hear a ringing sound in her ears. Her hands were shaking visibly. She wanted to defend herself, wanted to explain that it wasn't like that, but the words wouldn't come. They were stuck somewhere in her throat, tangled up with the panic that was rising like floodwater. Mr. Richardson continued his assault of questions, his tone becoming increasingly accusatory. In fact, Emma, isn't it true that you use this dog as an excuse to avoid facing your fears? Isn't it true that instead of learning to be brave and independent, you're hiding behind this animal? Emma's mother half rose from her seat, but her lawyer pulled her back down, whispering urgently. The judge watched silently, her expression unreadable. Emma's breathing had become rapid and shallow. Little spots were starting to appear in her vision. She gripped the edge of the witness stand so hard her knuckles turned white. This was it. This was the moment when everything would fall apart. This was the moment when the judge would decide that she was broken and weak, that she didn't deserve to stay with her mother, that she needed to learn to be stronger. She looked desperately toward the gallery where Buddy sat, and in that moment of absolute desperation, her hand moved almost of its own accord. The fluorescent lights seemed to pulse with a sickly yellow glow. Emma's vision had narrowed to a tunnel, with Mr. Richardson's face at the center, sharp-featured, cold-eyed, relentless. His voice continued, each word like a brick being added to a wall that was slowly suffocating her. Isn't it true that you're using this dog to avoid becoming a strong, independent person? Isn't it true that your mother has encouraged this dependency because she wants to keep you dependent on her? Isn't it true? Emma's hands were visibly trembling now. Anyone in the courtroom could see it. Her fingers gripped the edge of the witness stand with such force that her nails had turned white. Sweat had begun to trickle down her temple. Her breathing had become a rapid, shallow pattern in, that wasn't providing her lungs with nearly enough oxygen. She felt lightheaded, dizzy. Her ears were ringing with a high-pitched tone that seemed to be getting louder. This was a full panic attack. Emma recognized the symptoms because she'd experienced them many times before, in the middle of the night, in the school cafeteria, in shopping malls, in the car on the way to family gatherings. But never before had she experienced one while sitting in a witness stand, with every eye in the courtroom focused on her, with her entire future being decided by the man attacking her with words. "Mr. Richardson," the judge said, her voice carrying a note of warning, "perhaps we should take a brief recess." But Mr. Richardson didn't seem to hear her, or perhaps he chose not to. "Emma, I'm going to ask you one more time. Without that dog, can you function as a normal 12-year-old girl, yes or no?" The question was the final brick. Emma's breathing became even more rapid. Her heart, which had been racing, seemed to be attempting to escape her chest entirely. She opened her mouth to answer, but no sound came out, just a small, strangled gasp. Her mother stood up. "That's enough." His voice rang out across the courtroom, sharp with maternal protectiveness. "She's having a panic attack. Stop questioning her." The judge's gavel came down with a sharp crack. "Ms., you need to sit down, now." But the damage was already done. Emma's body had begun to shut down, not in the sense of losing consciousness, but in the way that a cornered animal might freeze. Her skin had gone pale. Beads of perspiration covered her forehead. Her hands shook with such intensity that she could barely grip the stand. The spots in her vision had into a constellation of black dots dancing across her field of sight. She felt like she was dying. Not metaphorically, actually dying. Her heart was going to give out. Her lungs would collapse. Her brain would explode. These were the thoughts that came during her panic attacks, irrational and terrifying, but absolutely convincing in their intensity. Every cell in her body screamed that something was catastrophically wrong, that she was in mortal danger, that she needed to escape immediately or she would cease to exist. And then, in that moment of absolute psychological and physiological crisis, Emma's hand moved. It wasn't a conscious decision. There was no deliberation, no thought process. It was pure instinct, the same instinct that causes a person to reach for a railing when they're falling, or to shield their eyes when something bright is shining in their face. Emma's arm extended downward, toward the gallery, toward the one being in that entire courtroom who had ever made her feel safe. Her hand found Buddy's head. She tapped once. It was the gentlest of touches, barely more than a brush of her fingertips against the soft golden fur between his ears. It was a gesture so small and subtle that most people probably wouldn't have even noticed it. But everyone who had been trained to notice it understood exactly what it meant. It was the signal, the code, the desperate cry for help from a child whose nervous system had reached its breaking point. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. For a moment, just a single crystalline moment, nothing happened. The silence was absolute. Even the air conditioning system seemed to pause in its humming. Mr. Richardson stood frozen mid-gesture, his hand still raised from his last accusatory point. The judge sat perfectly still, her gavel resting on the bench. Emma's father, who had been leaning forward with an expression of grim satisfaction at how his lawyer was dismantling his daughter's credibility, suddenly straightened, confusion crossing his face. Because then Buddy moved. The golden retriever had been lying calmly in the gallery next to Emma's mother, seemingly oblivious to the courtroom drama unfolding before him. But the moment Emma's fingers made contact with his head, something ancient and powerful activated within him. It was as though someone had flipped a switch, awakening a purpose that had been bred into him through generations of service dogs, refined through months of specific training, and perfected through 3 years of living with and protecting Emma. Buddy rose to his feet with fluid grace. The movement itself was beautiful, a smooth, deliberate unfolding of muscle and bone. But what happened next was extraordinary. The dog turned toward Emma, his brown eyes fixed on hers with absolute, unwavering focus. And then, with the precision of an athlete who had trained for this exact moment thousands of times, Buddy placed his front paws directly on the railing that separated the gallery from the witness stand. Then he jumped. It was a controlled jump, powerful but not aggressive. He landed with his front paws positioned directly on Emma's lap, his substantial weight, 70 pounds of golden retriever, immediately pressing against her trembling body. His head came up to her chest, his face angling upward so that his eyes remained locked with hers. The moment his weight settled against her, something shifted. The physical pressure was grounding. It was real. It was tangible. It was something Emma's panicked nervous system could actually register and process. The sensation of Buddy's warm body against hers, the weight of his paws on her lap, the feel of his fur beneath her fingers, all of it pulled her back from the edge of the abyss she'd been falling into. Emma's arms came up automatically, her fingers threading through Buddy's soft golden coat. She buried her face against his head, inhaling his familiar scent, a combination of dog shampoo, sunshine, and something indescribably comforting that she couldn't quite name but that meant safety to her. Her breathing, which had been rapid and shallow and ineffective, began to slow. In, hold for a count of 4, out for a count of 6. Buddy remained absolutely still, his body serving as an anchor, his presence serving as a statement, I am here. You are not alone. You are safe. Tears began to stream down Emma's face, not tears of fear anymore, but tears of relief, gratitude, and overwhelming emotion. Her shoulders, which had been hunched up around her ears, began to relax. The ringing in her ears started to fade. The spots in her vision began to clear. And in that moment, with a 12-year-old girl with dark hair crying against the neck of a golden retriever who had just performed his most important job, something shifted in the entire courtroom. Because everyone watching understood what they were witnessing. This wasn't dependency. This wasn't weakness. This wasn't a child hiding behind a crutch or avoiding the difficulty of growing up. This was a person in crisis being saved by a connection so profound, so genuine, so undeniably necessary that it transcended words or argument or legal maneuvering. This was love. This was necessity. This was a lifeline. This was exactly what a service dog was supposed to do, and it was doing it perfectly. Retry time seemed to fracture into slow, crystalline moments as Buddy's 70 pounds of golden retriever settled against Emma's body with perfect, practiced precision. His front paws remained planted firmly on her lap, his considerable weight distributed across her legs in exactly the way that would be most grounding without being painful or restrictive. His head pressed against her chest, positioned right over her heart, and Emma's arms instinctively wrapped around his neck, her fingers threading through his soft fur. What was happening in this moment was far more sophisticated than most people in the courtroom understood. Buddy wasn't simply being comforting, though he was. He was performing a complex series of trained therapeutic responses that had been specifically designed to interrupt a panic attack and help regulate Emma's nervous system. First, there was the deep pressure therapy. The weight of Buddy's body against Emma's provided what therapists called proprioceptive input information about pressure and position that helped Emma's brain understand where her body was in space. When someone is in a panic attack, their brain becomes confused about their own physical boundaries. The pressure of Buddy's body served as a reset button, telling Emma's nervous system, "You are here. You are real. You are physically present in this moment." As Emma's arms wrapped around Buddy's neck, he remained perfectly, utterly still. This was crucial. Any movement, any fidgeting, any sign of anxiety from the dog would have transmitted back to Emma through the physical connection between them. But Buddy had been trained for this. He knew that his job in this moment was to be an anchor, stable, constant, immovable. His body language communicated absolute calm, which began to influence Emma's nervous system through a process called emotional contagion. Calm could be transferred from one nervous system to another through physical proximity, and Buddy had mastered this skill. Emma's breathing, which had been rapid and shallow, the signature breathing pattern of a panic attack, began to shift. With her face buried against Buddy's neck and her arms wrapped around him, her breath naturally deepened. She found herself matching the rhythm of Buddy's breathing, which was slow and steady, approximately 12 breaths per minute. Without consciously deciding to do so, Emma's respiratory rate began to synchronize with his. In through the nose for a count of 4. Hold for a count of 4. Out through the mouth for a count of 6. Within 30 seconds, her breathing had normalized from a panicked 40 breaths per minute to a healthy, manageable rate. With normalized breathing came increased oxygen flow to her brain. The began to fade. The ringing in her ears started to diminish. The spots dancing across her vision began to clear. Her heart rate, which had been pounding at a terrifying 140 beats per minute, began to slow. With each normal breath, with each moment of physical contact with Buddy, her sympathetic nervous system, the fight-or-flight system that had been in overdrive, began to downregulate. Her parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest system, began to activate. But Buddy was doing even more than this. Through the gentle pressure of his body and the warmth of his fur, he was triggering the release of oxytocin in Emma's brain. Oxytocin is sometimes called the bonding hormone or the love hormone, and it has profound calming effects on the human nervous system. It reduces cortisol, the stress hormone that had been flooding Emma's system. It lowers blood pressure. It reduces inflammation. It creates a sense of safety and connection. Buddy's presence was literally changing Emma's brain chemistry. And all of this was happening silently, invisibly, in the space of perhaps 45 seconds. In the gallery's hand flew to her mouth. She had seen Emma have panic attacks before, many times, but she had never seen the recovery happen this quickly, this completely. Tears sprang to her eyes, not tears of distress, but tears of witnessing something profound. Her lawyer, David Martinez, placed a hand on her shoulder, his own eyes widening with recognition of what was occurring. Deputy Johnson, the court officer who had worked in this courthouse for 17 years without allowing himself to show emotion during court proceedings, felt something shift in his chest. He had children. He knew what it was like to see a child in distress and feel powerless to help. But this dog, this remarkable golden retriever, was doing what all the adults in the room had failed to do. He was helping. He was healing. He was making a difference in a way that transcended legal arguments or courtroom protocol. The deputy's hand unconsciously moved to his face, and he found himself wiping away a tear with the back of his hand. In another section of the gallery, a woman named a court stenographer who had worked in this courthouse for 12 years had also stopped typing. Her fingers lay still on her stenotype machine. She was staring at Emma and Buddy, watching the transformation occurring in real time. She thought about her own daughter, who had anxiety issues, who struggled in social situations, who sometimes couldn't leave the house without assistance. She thought about how different her daughter's life might be if she had access to this kind of help. Tears began to stream down her face. Mr. Richardson stood frozen, his hand still raised mid-gesture from his last accusatory question. His sharp lawyer's mind was processing what he was seeing, but it didn't fit into any of his prepared arguments. This wasn't about dependency. This wasn't about a child being coddled. This was something else entirely, something primal and real and undeniable. Judge removed her reading glasses slowly. Her hands trembled slightly as she set them on the bench before her. She had presided over hundreds of custody cases. She had heard countless arguments about what was in a child's best interest. She had listened to expert testimony from psychologists and social workers and custody evaluators. But nothing, absolutely nothing, she had encountered in her 31 years on the bench had prepared her for what she was witnessing now. She saw, with absolute clarity, that this dog was not a crutch or a dependency or a sign of weakness. This dog was a medical device. This dog was a service animal performing exactly the function he had been trained to perform. This dog was saving this child's life in real time. Emma's father, Michael, felt his stomach clench. His new girlfriend had been wrong. His lawyer had been wrong. He had been wrong. Looking at his daughter now, her face buried against the dog's neck, her body finally relaxed, her breathing finally normal, he saw something he had been missing. He saw his daughter's courage. He saw her vulnerability. He saw her need. And he saw that need being met perfectly, precisely, by the animal she had bonded with. For the first time since the divorce proceedings had begun, Michael felt genuine shame. Buddy remained absolutely still throughout all of this. He didn't move his head. He didn't shift his weight. He didn't seek acknowledgement or praise. He simply stayed, present and calm and grounding, doing exactly what he had been born and trained to do. After perhaps 2 minutes, Emma's breathing had completely normalized. Her heart rate had returned to a healthy range. The panic that had been consuming her had receded like a tide going out, leaving her exhausted but intact, terrified but alive. She looked up from Buddy's neck, her eyes wet with tears, and made eye contact with the judge. In that moment, without a single word being spoken, everything changed. The first sound came from Emma's mother. It wasn't quite a sob and wasn't quite a gasp. It was something in between, a raw vocalization of emotion that had been building up over months of worry and stress and maternal fear. His hand flew to her mouth, but the sound had already escaped. It hung in the air of the courtroom like a note that refused to fade. Then another hand went up. A woman in the third row of the gallery, a woman Emma didn't even know, a stranger who had likely wandered into the wrong courtroom and stayed because the case was fascinating, stood to her feet. Tears were streaming down her face. She didn't say anything. She simply stood, bearing witness, unable to remain sitting. Then another person stood, and another. It was like a wave beginning to crest, slow at first, then gathering momentum. A young man in his 20s, who appeared to be some kind of court clerk or paralegal, stood up with his hand over his heart. An elderly couple in the back row rose together, the woman leaning on her husband's arm. A teenager who had apparently been waiting outside the courtroom for a different case noticed the commotion and poked his head in, saw what was happening and stepped inside, moved by something he couldn't quite name. Deputy Johnson, the stone-faced court officer who had worked in that courthouse through 17 years of custody disputes, divorces, custody violations, and all manner of human tragedy, removed his uniform cap and held it to his chest. His face was wet with tears, not silent tears that could be discreetly wiped away, but streaming tears that ran down his weathered cheeks and dripped onto his uniform. He wasn't trying to hide them anymore. He didn't care if anyone saw. What he was witnessing transcended professional protocol. The court stenographer had abandoned her machine entirely. Her hands were covering her face, her shoulders shaking with emotion. Around her, other people, lawyers waiting for their own cases, court staff, observers, began to cry. It was as though Buddy's calm, grounding presence had somehow given everyone in the room permission to feel what they had been holding back, permission to acknowledge the rawness of human suffering, permission to recognize the profound beauty of a connection that transcends species. A court reporter in the back, a man named Thomas who had been transcribing court proceedings for over 20 years, found himself thinking about his own son, who had severe autism and who had recently been matched with a service dog of his own. He thought about the transformation he had witnessed in his boy over the past 3 months. He thought about seeing his son, who hadn't made eye contact with another human being in 5 years, make eye contact with his service dog. He thought about the first time his son had slept through the entire night without nightmares. The tears came freely now, mixing with memories of his own journey. In the gallery, David Martinez, Emma's mother's lawyer, sat very still. His years of legal training had taught him to remain composed, to maintain professional distance, to view cases as intellectual puzzles to be solved. But this transcended legal strategy. This was about the fundamental human need for connection, for safety, for being understood and helped by another being who asked nothing in return except to be present. He reached over and squeezed hand, and she squeezed back, their shared relief and vindication flowing between them through that simple touch. The judge sat completely still, her reading glasses resting on the bench before her. Her hands were folded on the desk, but her fingers trembled slightly. Judge had presided over hundreds of cases. She had rendered thousands of judicial decisions. She had prided herself on her objectivity, her ability to separate emotion from legal reasoning. But in this moment, she recognized that some truths transcended legal argumentation. She understood with absolute clarity that she had been about to witness, and potentially allow, a grave injustice. Mr. Richardson remained standing near the witness stand, and the transformation in his demeanor was stark. His aggressive posture had crumbled. His sharp features had softened. His ice-blue eyes, which had seemed so cold and predatory moments before, now appeared confused and devastated. He looked at Emma, who was still embraced against Buddy's neck, and then he looked at his client, Emma's father, and saw something reflected there that made him feel physically ill. Michael was crying. Not subtle tears that could be explained away as courtroom stress or frustration with the proceedings. These were deep, body-racking sobs that came from somewhere fundamental within him. His new girlfriend, sitting beside him, had turned away, uncomfortable with this display of emotion. But Michael didn't care about her discomfort. He was witnessing something that had shattered his carefully constructed justifications for his actions. He was watching his daughter, his little girl, be saved by an animal because the adults in her life hadn't done the job. And not because they couldn't, but because he, specifically, had fought against it. He had let his ego and his girlfriend's dismissive attitude convince him that his daughter was weak, when in reality, his daughter was showing extraordinary courage in recognizing what she needed and accepting help. The courtroom erupted into murmurs, not angry murmurs but emotional ones. People whispered to each other. A woman near the back audibly sobbed. Someone said, "Oh my God," over and over again like a prayer or an invocation. The air in the room had transformed from the sterile, adversarial atmosphere of a legal proceeding into something more like a sacred space, a place where truth was being revealed not through argument but through lived experience. The judge raised her gavel, not with the sharp authority she typically used, but gently, almost reluctantly. "Order," she said, her voice quiet but commanding. "I need order in the courtroom." Gradually, the murmuring subsided, but the emotional charge remained. People remained standing. People continued to cry. It was as though everyone in that room had recognized, simultaneously, that they were witnessing something that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Emma, still embraced against Buddy's neck, looked up at the judge. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying, but they were clear now. Present, no longer panicked. She had survived this moment, she had been helped through it, and everyone had seen it. Buddy remained perfectly still, his job complete, his purpose fulfilled. The dog's brown eyes seemed to survey the courtroom with a kind of knowing calm, as though he understood that what he had done in those few moments had changed everything. In the gallery, reached down and placed her hand on Buddy's back. The dog turned his head slightly and made brief eye contact with her, a moment of acknowledgement between two beings who loved the same girl, who had both been fighting to protect her, who had both just been vindicated in the most profound way possible. Emma's father sat in his seat, his face in his hands. His lawyer placed a tentative hand on his shoulder, but Mr. Richardson seemed unable to offer any advice or guidance. What could he possibly say? What legal argument could possibly counter what had just been demonstrated? The air in the courtroom had shifted from adversarial to something approaching reverent. Everyone understood, without words, that they had just witnessed something important, something true, something that no amount of legal argumentation could diminish or dispute. The sound of a gavel would come next. There would be a recess. There would be further proceedings. But the outcome in that moment was already determined. Because everyone in that courtroom had just witnessed the most powerful testimony imaginable. Not testimony given in words, but testimony given through the bond between a girl and her dog. Testimony that transcended human language and spoke directly to the heart of what every person in that room understood at their core. That sometimes the most important help comes not from judges or lawyers or experts, but from the simple, profound presence of a being who loves you completely and unconditionally. Mr. Richardson remained frozen in place for approximately 10 seconds after the gavel came down. It was a brief eternity, the kind of moment where time seems to operate on a different frequency. His right hand was still extended from his last point, his arm suspended mid-gesture like an actor who had suddenly forgotten his lines. His sharp features, which had seemed so perfectly controlled mere moments before, had begun to crumble. The first crack appeared around his eyes. His ice-blue gaze shifted from Emma to Buddy, then back to Emma again. He was processing something, working through a calculation that had nothing to do with legal precedent or case strategy. The aggressive confidence that had defined his entire demeanor throughout the cross-examination seemed to be evaporating, like morning fog burning away under intense sunlight. Slowly, mechanically, Mr. Richardson lowered his arm. He turned to look at his client, Michael, and what he saw there made something shift inside him. Michael's face was completely covered by his hands. His shoulders were shaking with the intensity of his sobs. His new girlfriend, the woman who had started this entire custody battle by suggesting that Emma was being coddled, had turned away from him, her body language broadcasting discomfort and rejection. She was checking her phone, apparently more interested in her messages than in the man she had convinced to fight for custody of his daughter. The contrast was devastating. Mr. Richardson had built an entire career on winning, on dominating courtrooms, on breaking down witnesses, particularly child witnesses, to expose inconsistencies in testimony and reveal what he believed to be manufactured dependencies or coached responses. He had a 93% custody case win rate. He had earned a reputation as the most ruthless family law attorney in 3 counties. Parents hired him specifically because they knew he would do whatever was necessary to ensure they prevailed. But watching Michael cry, watching that man's entire worldview collapse in real time, Mr. Richardson felt something he hadn't experienced in years: doubt. Actual, visceral doubt about whether he had done the right thing. He looked back at Emma and Buddy. The girl was no longer crying now. Her breathing had stabilized. Her color had returned to normal. She was petting Buddy's head gently, her fingers moving through his golden fur in a repetitive, soothing motion. The dog remained perfectly still, occasionally glancing up at her with an expression of such complete devotion that it was almost painful to witness. This wasn't dependency. Mr. Richardson suddenly understood this with absolute clarity. He had spent the last hour arguing that Emma's reliance on Buddy was evidence of weakness, of poor parenting, of a child who hadn't been taught to be resilient. But watching what had just occurred, watching a child go through what was clearly a severe medical event and be brought back from the brink of psychological collapse by the precise intervention of a trained service animal, he recognized that he had been fundamentally, catastrophically wrong. Buddy hadn't enabled Emma's anxiety. Buddy had provided her with the tools to manage it. The realization hit Mr. Richardson like a physical blow to the chest. He thought about all the other custody cases he had won. He thought about the children involved in those cases. How many of them had been separated from parents who genuinely loved them? How many of his victories had been based on legal technicalities rather than what was actually best for the child? How many of his arguments had prioritized his client's desires over the child's? These weren't comfortable questions. Mr. Richardson walked back to his seat slowly, his usual confident stride replaced by something more like a shuffle. He sat down without making eye contact with Michael. The chair felt different than it had that morning, less like a position of power and more like a place to hide. He opened his leather portfolio and pretended to review his notes, but his eyes weren't actually seeing the words written there. His mind was somewhere else entirely. It was in the dozens of custody cases he had won through aggressive cross-examination. It was in the faces of children he had questioned, sometimes ruthlessly, in service of his client's agenda. Had he ever been wrong before? Had he ever, in his career, broken down a child's testimony only to later learn that the child had been telling the truth? That the dependency or anxiety or trauma the child displayed was genuine and not manufactured? The thought made him feel physically ill. Beside him, Michael continued to cry. The sobs had become quieter, more controlled, but they were still coming. Michael's new girlfriend had now stood up and excused herself from the courtroom, muttering something about needing air. She didn't return. Michael didn't even seem to notice. When Mr. Richardson finally looked up, his eyes connected with Judge's. It was a moment of profound communication between 2 legal professionals, a look that transcended words. The judge's expression was complex. Disappointment, certainly, but also something that might have been compassion. She had seen attorneys make aggressive moves in courtrooms countless times. She understood that it was the job of a defense attorney to challenge testimony and cross-examine witnesses. But she also seemed to be communicating something else, a recognition that there were limits to how far that aggression should go, especially with children. Mr. Richardson looked away first. He then looked at David Martinez, Emma's mother's lawyer. David was looking at him with an expression of profound sadness, not anger or triumph or vindication, just sadness. The sadness of watching another person cause harm, either through malice or through ignorance. Mr. Richardson realized that David wasn't his enemy. David was another human being, trying to do his job, trying to protect a child. And what had Mr. Richardson been doing? He had been attacking that child, dismantling her credibility, suggesting that she was weak and dependent and broken. The weight of that recognition was almost suffocating. In the gallery behind him, he could hear people whispering. He caught fragments of conversation. That poor girl, and that was cruel, and how could he? The judgment in their voices was clear and unambiguous. They understood in a way that Mr. Richardson was only now beginning to understand, that he had crossed a line. He thought about his own children, a daughter who was 12 years old and a son who was 14. He thought about how he would feel if an attorney treated them the way he had just treated Emma. He thought about what his daughter might be experiencing if she were in Emma's position, having her credibility attacked in front of a room full of strangers while she was in the middle of a medical crisis. The thought was unbearable. Mr. Richardson reached into his portfolio and pulled out a bottle of antacids. He had chronic acid reflux, a condition that his own physician had suggested was stress-related. He popped 2 tablets into his mouth and chewed them mechanically. The chalky taste seemed appropriate somehow, like the physical manifestation of the bitter realization that was occurring inside him. He had spent years building a reputation as a ruthless attorney. He had won cases. He had made substantial money. He had earned the respect, or at least the fear, of his colleagues. But sitting in this courtroom with the echoes of a child's panic attack still seeming to reverberate off the walls, Mr. Richardson recognized that his victories might have come at a cost he had never fully acknowledged. Judge began speaking, her voice steady and authoritative. "We will take a 30-minute recess. When we reconvene, I expect all parties to have reconsidered their positions in light of what has just transpired in this courtroom." It was a diplomatic way of saying that the judge was giving everyone, particularly Mr. Richardson and Michael, time to come to their senses, time to recalibrate, time to recognize that they were on the wrong side of this case. As the courtroom began to empty, Mr. Richardson sat motionless at the defense table. He didn't gather his papers. He didn't consult with his client. He simply sat, staring at nothing, a man confronting the possibility that his entire career had been built on a foundation of questionable ethics and aggressive strategies that prioritized winning over. Michael approached his lawyer slowly. "I want to talk to," he said quietly. "I want to work something out. I don't want to fight anymore. I was wrong." Mr. Richardson looked at his client and nodded slowly. "I think that's the right decision," he said, and then more quietly, "I think I was wrong too." It was the first time in his entire legal career that Mr. Richardson had admitted that to a client. The courtroom reconvened at 2:47 in the afternoon. The 30-minute recess had felt like both an eternity and a mere blink to Emma, who sat in a small room adjacent to the courthouse with her mother, Buddy resting his head on her lap. Had held her daughter while she cried, not words of reassurance, because what could be reassuring about a custody battle but simply the physical comfort of maternal presence? Emma's hands were steady now. Her breathing was normal. The panic attack had completely subsided, leaving behind only exhaustion and a kind of emotional hollowness that came from having been through something traumatic. But there was also something else, a sense of clarity. Everyone in that courtroom had seen what Buddy could do. Everyone had witnessed the truth that words alone could never communicate. When the bailiff came to retrieve them, Emma stood on legs that felt slightly wobbly but functional. Her mother squeezed her hand. Buddy rose gracefully and positioned himself beside Emma, ready to be her anchor for whatever came next. The courtroom was full again. Word had apparently spread about what had occurred during the morning session. There were more observers now, people who had heard about the service dog and the panic attack and wanted to witness the conclusion of this unusual case. The energy in the room was different now, less adversarial, more contemplative. Judge entered from her chambers and took her seat. She looked tired, as though she had spent the recess not relaxing but processing, deliberating, wrestling with the gravity of the decision she was about to render. She adjusted her reading glasses and opened the case file before her. Her eyes, when she looked up, seemed to scan the entire courtroom before settling on Emma. For a moment, judge and child made eye contact, and something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of what had transpired, a recognition of the truth that had been revealed. "This court will come to order," Judge said, her voice carrying the formal authority of her position but also something warmer, something more human than the typical judicial tone. "We have concluded testimony in the matter of versus, regarding the custody of minor child Emma." She paused, removing her glasses and setting them on the bench. This was unusual. Judges typically kept their glasses on while rendering decisions. The gesture somehow made her seem more human, more personal. "Before I render my decision, I want to make a statement for the record," Judge continued. "What occurred in this courtroom this morning was extraordinary. What I witnessed was not a matter of legal interpretation or precedent. What I witnessed was medical reality, a child experiencing a significant anxiety disorder, and a service animal performing exactly the therapeutic function it was trained to perform." She looked directly at Mr. Richardson. "I have been a judge for 31 years. In that time, I have seen aggressive cross-examination. I have seen skilled attorneys press witnesses to their limits. That is sometimes necessary in service of justice. However, I have also come to understand that there are limits to how far that aggression should extend, particularly when the witness is a child experiencing a documented medical condition." The courtroom was completely silent. Even the air conditioning seemed to pause in its humming. "The testimony provided by Emma this morning was not the testimony of a dependent child clinging to a crutch," Judge continued. "It was the testimony of a child with a legitimate medical condition, generalized anxiety disorder, describing the treatment and management of that condition. Service animals are recognized by the Americans with Disabilities Act as medical devices. They are no different than a wheelchair for a child who cannot walk, or glasses for a child who cannot see clearly." She paused, allowing this statement to settle. "I have reviewed the evidence presented by both parties. I have considered the psychological evaluations, the school records, the testimony from Emma's teachers and therapist, and I have witnessed with my own eyes what occurs when Emma is separated from her service animal during times of extreme stress." Judge leaned forward slightly. "The evidence is overwhelming and unambiguous. Emma has a legitimate medical need for her service dog, Buddy. This need is not a weakness. It is not a failure on the part of her mother. It is not evidence of poor parenting or overprotectiveness. It is a medical reality that requires a medical intervention." She picked up a document from her bench and adjusted her reading glasses, which she had retrieved. "Therefore, I render the following decision in the matter of custody and care of minor child Emma." Everyone in the courtroom seemed to lean forward slightly, waiting. "Primary custody is awarded to the child's mother. Emma will reside with her mother during the school week and maintain close contact with her father during weekends and holidays, as further detailed in my written order." Judge paused, and then she said something that made the gallery audibly gasp. "However, this custody arrangement is contingent upon one critical condition. Emma retains the right to maintain her service dog, Buddy, with her at all times and under all circumstances. This includes overnight visits with her father. Any attempt to separate Emma from her service dog will be considered a violation of the custody order and will result in immediate modification of visitation privileges." She continued, "Furthermore, I am ordering that both parents complete a 12-week educational program on anxiety disorders in service animals. This program will be administered by the court and will be mandatory for both parties. The purpose of this program is to ensure that both parents understand the medical necessity of Emma's service animal and are committed to supporting her mental health needs." Judge looked directly at Michael. "Mister, I understand that you were influenced by misinformation regarding your daughter's anxiety disorder and her service animal. However, as her father, You have a responsibility to educate yourself about her medical needs. Ignorance is not an excuse for attempting to separate a child from necessary medical treatment. Michael nodded slowly, his eyes downcast but his posture demonstrating acceptance. I also want to address the issue of therapy going forward, Judge said. Emma will continue her current therapy with Doctor, and both parents will be required to participate in family therapy sessions. The goal of this therapy is to help this family heal from the trauma of this divorce and custody battle, and to ensure that Emma's needs are prioritized above all else. The judge then did something highly unusual. She removed her glasses again and spoke in a tone that was less judicial and more personal. I want to say something off the record, which I will later include in my written opinion, she said. In my 31 years on this bench, I have learned that the law is not always equipped to handle matters of the human heart. The law deals in precedent and regulation, but what I witnessed this morning transcended law. I witnessed love. I witnessed a child's bond with an animal that had literally saved her life. I witnessed the power of connection and acceptance. She paused, and her eyes glistened slightly. Emma, you showed extraordinary courage in this courtroom today. Your service dog, buddy, showed the kind of loyalty and dedication that reminds us why we have these animals in our lives. Your mother showed the kind of protective love that every child deserves to experience. And your father, she looked at Michael, I believe you now understand what truly matters. Judge put her glasses back on. This court's decision is final. A detailed written order will be provided to all parties within 48 hours. We are adjourned. The gavel came down, but it was a gentle sound, not the sharp crack of authority, but the soft conclusion of a case that had resolved itself not through legal maneuvering but through truth. The gallery erupted, not in chaotic noise but in a wave of emotional release. People stood. Some applauded. Others cried. The woman who had stood during the outburst earlier was now standing again, her hands over her heart. Deputy Johnson, the court officer, was visibly moved, his professional composure finally cracking. Immediately pulled her daughter into an embrace. Emma, who had remained so composed throughout the legal proceedings, finally allowed herself to fully break down, not in panic or fear, but in relief and gratitude, and the simple joy of knowing that she had been heard, believed, and protected by the system that had seemed so threatening just hours before. Buddy remained at Emma's side throughout, his presence steady and grounding, his job now complete. 6 months had passed since that extraordinary day in the courtroom. Emma sat in the gymnasium of Lincoln Middle School, Buddy lying calmly at her feet, watching as the spring assembly unfolded before her. The bleachers around her were packed with students, parents, and teachers. The air buzzed with the kind of anticipatory energy that always accompanied school assemblies, a mixture of excitement and the collective restlessness of teenagers forced to sit still. She was no longer afraid. That was the most striking change that Emma had noticed about herself in the months following the custody verdict. The ambient anxiety that had colored her entire existence for so many years had diminished significantly. It hadn't disappeared entirely. Doctor had explained that anxiety disorders didn't simply vanish. They were managed and lived with, but the intensity had decreased dramatically. Emma still had anxious moments. She still sometimes felt the flutter of panic beginning in her chest during stressful situations. But now those moments were manageable. Now she had tools to handle them. Now she had Buddy. The previous night, she had attended the school's choir rehearsal for the assembly performance. This would have been unthinkable a year ago. A year ago, Emma couldn't have sat in a choir room with 30 other students and a demanding choir director without experiencing overwhelming anxiety. But yesterday evening, she had stood in the alto section, her voice blending with the other singers, feeling nervous but functional, anxious but not debilitated. Her music teacher, Ms., had pulled her aside after rehearsal. "Emma, your voice has really opened up this year," she had said. "You sound so much more confident. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." Emma had smiled and thanked her, but she knew what had changed. It wasn't magic. It was stability. It was knowing that her living situation was secure. It was having a therapist who understood her. It was having a father who had finally, genuinely, committed to understanding her needs. And it was having Buddy, whose presence had become so woven into the fabric of her daily existence that she couldn't imagine life without him. The real transformation, though, had occurred in her father. Michael had taken the court-ordered educational program about anxiety disorders seriously. He had attended every session, taken detailed notes, and asked thoughtful questions. He had read books about service animals. He had interviewed other parents whose children had anxiety disorders. And perhaps most importantly, he had apologized to Emma, not a surface apology meant to appease her, but a genuine, tearful acknowledgement of the harm his actions had caused and his commitment to do better. "I was wrong," he had told her one Saturday afternoon during their first post-verdict visitation. "I was so focused on winning the custody battle that I stopped seeing you as my daughter. I started seeing you as the prize I was trying to win. I'm sorry, Emma. I'm so sorry." Emma had cried and he had held her, and something had shifted between them. The relationship wasn't repaired instantly. Betrayal, even unintentional betrayal, took time to heal, but it had begun to heal. And with each subsequent visit, with each conversation about her anxiety, with each moment of genuine support, the relationship grew stronger. 2 months after the verdict, Michael had brought Emma a gift, a beautiful leather collar for Buddy, embossed with the dog's name and Michael's phone number. "I want to know I have a way to help Buddy help you," he had explained. "If you ever get separated, if Buddy ever gets lost, I want to be." It was a small gesture, but it had communicated something profound. Emma's father was now truly on her team. The relationship with his girlfriend had not survived. Within a few weeks of the courtroom verdict, Michael had ended the relationship. The girlfriend had made it clear that she wasn't interested in being part of a family that required this level of accommodation for a child's emotional problems. Michael had realized that choosing between his daughter and this woman was no choice at all. "I should have recognized that months ago," he had told Emma. "I let someone who didn't understand you influence my judgment. That won't happen again." In the gymnasium, Emma watched as the choir filed onto the stage. She had chosen not to participate in this particular assembly. The stage lighting was too bright, and she wanted to observe from the relative safety of the gymnasium floor, with Buddy beside her. But she applauded enthusiastically when Ms. and the choir were introduced. Her mother sat a few rows away, also watching with proud eyes, had continued working with her own therapist throughout the custody battle and its aftermath. The divorce had been stressful and traumatic, but it had also given her clarity. She had recommitted herself to her career as a social worker. She had set healthy boundaries with Michael, and she had become increasingly passionate about advocating for children with anxiety disorders and their families. In fact, was currently working on developing a support group for parents of children with service animals. She had been interviewed by the local news station about her work, and her advocacy had already helped 3 other families in the community obtain service animals for their anxious children. "You and Buddy started something bigger than ourselves," she had told Emma proudly. As the choir began to sing, Emma felt Buddy shift slightly beside her, adjusting his position to maintain contact with her leg. The dog had aged slightly in the 6 months since the courtroom verdict. There was a bit more gray in his muzzle, a slight stiffness in his movements when he first stood up, but his dedication to his job had never wavered. Dr. Emma's therapist had explained that service dogs had an average working of about 7 to 10 years. Buddy was already 7 years old, which meant that they had perhaps another 3 to 4 years together before he would need to retire. The thought made Emma's throat tight, but Doctor had also explained that retirement didn't mean the end of their relationship. Buddy would still be her companion. He would simply transition from an active service role to a pet role. "We'll figure out what comes next when the time comes," Doctor had assured her. "For now, Focus on appreciating the time you have with Buddy and the work he's doing to help you manage your anxiety. Emma had taken this advice to heart. She spent extra time with Buddy, grooming his coat, training him on new commands, simply sitting with him and appreciating his presence in her life. At the conclusion of the assembly, Emma stood with Buddy beside her and made her way through the crowd of students and parents. Teachers and peers stopped to pet Buddy. He had become something of a school celebrity in the months since the courtroom verdict. A local news story about Emma's case had spread throughout the community, and Buddy had become known as the service dog who changed a courtroom. Emma found this reputation somewhat amusing. Buddy didn't think of himself as extraordinary. He was simply doing his job, doing what he had been trained to do. But for the people around Emma, her teachers, her classmates, her parents, Buddy represented something larger. He represented the power of accepting help. He represented the courage required to acknowledge vulnerability. He represented the bond between humans and animals that transcended the boundaries of species. That evening, Emma sat at her desk and began writing in her journal, a practice she had maintained for several years but which had become more meaningful in recent months. She wrote about the assembly, about how her voice had sounded in the choir, about how she no longer felt paralyzed by anxiety in social situations. She wrote about her father's continued transformation and how much it meant to have him as a genuine ally in her mental health journey. She wrote about her mother's advocacy work and how proud she was of her mother's commitment to helping other families. And she wrote about Buddy. Buddy has taught me that asking for help isn't weakness, she wrote. Buddy has taught me that some of the strongest people are the ones who acknowledge their needs and accept support. Buddy has taught me that connection, real, genuine, non-judgmental connection, can heal wounds I didn't even know I had. I don't know what I would have done without him. That night, as Emma lay in bed with Buddy sleeping at her feet, she felt a profound sense of peace. The anxiety was still there. It would always be there, a part of her neurochemistry that she would manage for the rest of her life. But it no longer controlled her. It no longer defined her. It no longer determined what she could or couldn't do. She had learned, through the difficult crucible of the custody battle and the extraordinary intervention of her service dog, that vulnerability wasn't weakness. That asking for help wasn't failure. That connection with another being, human or animal, could literally transform your nervous system and your life. 1 year after the courtroom verdict, Emma stood on the stage of her school's graduation ceremony. Buddy was not with her physically. He remained in the gymnasium with her mother, but his influence was everywhere. Emma had been selected to give a brief speech about her experience managing anxiety while navigating middle school. Standing at the podium looking out at the sea of faces, Emma felt nervous, but she also felt capable. She took a breath, thought about Buddy's calming presence, and began to speak. "I want to tell you about the power of asking for help," she said. And as she shared her story, carefully edited for the school setting but honest about her struggles, she saw people nodding in recognition. She saw other kids with anxiety in the audience straighten up, as though hearing her words gave them permission to acknowledge their own struggles. And she realized that what had begun in a courtroom with one dog performing his job had rippled outward, touching lives she would never fully know about. That one moment of vulnerability, one gesture of a hand reaching down to tap a dog's head, had changed not just her life, but the lives of everyone who had witnessed it. Buddy had taught her that her story mattered, that her struggle mattered, that her life mattered. And that was the most important lesson of all. Retry and make mistakes. Please double-check responses.